A few years ago, I did what a lot of tech enthusiasts eventually do. I left Windows behind and moved to Linux. At first, it felt like freedom. No forced updates, no sudden restarts, no mysterious background processes eating my RAM. I felt in control. My system was fast, clean, minimal. I learned the terminal, customized my desktop, experimented with distributions. It felt empowering. But then something interesting happened. After months of daily driving Linux, I switched back to Windows. And for a brief moment, I thought I had made the right decision. But it didn't last. When I reinstalled Windows, I was chasing familiarity. There's something comforting about returning to an operating system you've used for years. The interface felt predictable. Applications I relied on for work launched without tweaks. Drivers installed automatically. My gaming library just worked. No compatibility layers. No wondering if the next update would break a dependency. It felt smooth, almost effortless. And in that first week, I told myself maybe Linux was just a phase. Windows has undeniable strengths. It's deeply integrated with a massive ecosystem of software. Creative tools, enterprise applications, niche programs. Many of them are built primarily for Windows. If you're using Adobe software, certain engineering programs, or proprietary tools, Windows often offers the most straightforward experience. There's a reason businesses standardize around it. There's a reason most consumer hardware is optimized for it. That convenience is powerful. And gaming, let's be honest. Windows dominates here. Even though Linux gaming has improved dramatically thanks to projects like Proton and Steam's efforts, there are still anti-cheat systems in certain titles that simply behave better on Windows. When I switched back, launching a game without worrying about compatibility felt refreshing. Everything ran as the developers intended. No extra configuration. No troubleshooting forums at midnight. But the honeymoon phase didn't last long. The first crack appeared in the form of updates. At first, I appreciated that Windows updates were handling security automatically. It felt responsible. Then one evening, right in the middle of a project, my system prompted me for a restart. I postponed it. It reminded me again and again. Eventually, it decided the update was happening. That loss of control subtle, but persistent, started to bother me. On Linux, I chose when and how updates happened. On Windows, it felt like negotiation. Then there was performance. Fresh Windows installs are fast. They're clean. But over time, background processes accumulate. Services run quietly. Startup programs creep back in. I noticed boot times getting longer. RAM usage idling higher than I remembered. Nothing catastrophic, but noticeable. On Linux, especially with lightweight desktop environments, the system felt lean even months in. Windows, in contrast, felt like it was slowly gathering weight. Privacy also became a recurring thought. Modern Windows versions integrate cloud services deeply. Telemetry, account syncing, recommendations, online search integration in the start menu. Some people love it. For me, it felt intrusive. I found myself digging through settings to disable things, turning off targeted ads, disabling suggestions, opting out of data collection where possible. It wasn't that Windows was malicious. It was that the default posture wasn't minimal. Linux, by contrast, felt neutral. It didn't assume anything about me. It didn't try to connect me to an ecosystem unless I chose to. Customization was another subtle difference that resurfaced. On Linux, I could transform my entire desktop environment, change window managers, modify system behavior at a granular level, script automation directly into the OS. When I returned to Windows, customization existed, but within boundaries. The registry can be edited. Third-party tools can tweak things. But the system isn't designed for deep reconfiguration in the same way. I began to miss that flexibility. Then came software development. On Linux, development environments feel native. Package managers streamline installations. Terminal tools integrate seamlessly. Bash, Z, SH, system level, utilities, they're all first-class citizens. Windows has improved tremendously with WSL, PowerShell, and modern tooling. But there was still a sense of layering. Like I was building a Linux-like experience on top of Windows rather than inside it. Small friction points added up. One weekend, I decided to set up a new development stack. On Linux, this would have taken minutes. On Windows, it required navigating installers, configuring environment variables, adjusting paths. None of it was impossible. Just slower. More fragmented. It made me realize how accustomed I had become to Linux's package management simplicity. And then there was the philosophical shift I didn't expect. Linux had changed how I thought about computing. It made me aware of what my system was doing. It encouraged curiosity. When something broke, I learned why. When something worked, I understood how. Windows, by design, abstracts complexity. That's its strength. But after living in an environment where transparency was the norm, abstraction felt limiting. I also noticed how Linux communities function differently. Forums, documentation, open source contributors, they foster a sense of collaboration. When you fix a bug or suggest an improvement, there's a pathway to contribute. With Windows, you're a consumer. Feedback exists, but the system's core is closed. You wait for updates rather than shaping them. I didn't realize how much I valued that participatory aspect until I stepped away from it. Hardware compatibility was one of the reasons I originally returned to Windows. Everything just works on Windows, especially niche peripherals. And yes, there were moments when that mattered. A printer driver installed instantly. A piece of audio equipment configured automatically. But over time, Linux hardware support has improved dramatically. In many cases, modern distributions detect and configure hardware seamlessly. The gap wasn't as wide as I remembered. The turning point came gradually. One day, I opened Task Manager out of curiosity. I saw dozens of processes running. Some essential, some mysterious. I researched a few. Many were tied to services I didn't use. I disabled what I could, but the system still felt busy. On Linux, I knew what was running. I could audit services easily. That transparency mattered more than I expected. Another subtle factor was resource efficiency. I installed Windows on an older laptop to test something. It ran, but it felt heavy. I remembered running a lightweight Linux distribution on similar hardware that felt snappy and responsive. Windows demands modern hardware to shine. Linux scales down gracefully. That realization lingered in the back of my mind. Over time, small annoyances compounded. The start menu occasionally showed suggestions I didn't want. Built-in apps I never used reappeared after updates. System settings were split between legacy control panels and modern interfaces. None of these were deal-breakers alone. But together, they created friction. Ironically, the very reasons I switched back to Windows convenience. Compatibility, familiarity became less compelling as I reevaluated my workflow. Most of my applications had Linux alternatives. Gaming on Linux had improved enough for my library. Development felt more natural on Linux. The trade-offs were shrinking. There was also a performance consistency I missed. Linux systems often maintain their speed over time. Windows, even with careful maintenance, can accumulate cruft. Registry entries, leftover files, background services, they slowly add complexity. Some users solve this with periodic reinstalls. But that solution felt like a workaround rather than a fix. Eventually, I asked myself a simple question. Why am I staying on Windows? The honest answer was inertia. Habit. Comfort. Not necessity. So I booted into a Linux Live USB one evening. The desktop loaded quickly. The interface felt familiar again. The terminal welcomed me like an old tool I'd set aside. Within hours, I felt productive. Within days, I remembered why I switched in the first place. When I finally reinstalled Linux as my primary OS again, it wasn't an act of rebellion against Windows. It was a recognition of fit. Windows is powerful. It serves millions of people perfectly. But for my workflow, my preferences, my philosophy of computing, Linux aligned better. Switching back to Windows taught me something valuable. It reminded me that operating systems aren't just tools. They shape how we interact with technology. They influence our sense of control, privacy, and efficiency. What works for one person may frustrate another. It also dismantled a myth I once believed, that going back to Windows would feel like coming home permanently. It did feel like home for a moment, but I had changed. My expectations had changed. My tolerance for certain design decisions had shifted. In the end, it didn't last because the reasons I left Linux weren't fundamental flaws. They were temporary inconveniences. The reasons I missed Linux were structural. They were about control, transparency, efficiency, and philosophy. Switching back to Windows wasn't a mistake. It was an experiment. It clarified what I value in an operating system. And sometimes, you need to step away from something to understand why you chose it in the first place. Today, when people ask me whether they should use Windows or Linux, I don't give a universal answer. I ask about their needs, their workflow, their priorities. Because both systems are mature, both are capable, but they serve different philosophies. For me, the return to Windows was brief. It was educational. It was nostalgic. But it didn't last, because once you've experienced true control over your system, it's hard to give it up. And that's why I switched back to Linux again.